I trust most of you have had an opportunity to see the paintings as well as that wonderful dance performance. It was magic, wasn't it? I love the way the dancers wove their way in and out of both the building and the paintings. Most of the paintings are by members of the Contemporary British Painting Group that was set up by a man called Robert Prizeman about 3-4 years ago now. And he set it up because he believed that painting was getting a bad press. No press, in fact. Although things, interestingly enough, have started to change. The tide is beginning to change. In fact, there was a painting show, painting exhibition recently at the Saatchi Gallery, emphasising the wonder of painting. Yes, let's see what happens with the Turner Prize. Maybe more painters will be put up for it in future. The title of the exhibition, Edgelands, the term was coined about 25 years ago, I think, wasn't it, by Marion Shord. Do I pronounce it Shord? Yeah. To describe the changing faces of Britain at that time, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. The works here are by Dan Coombs, Marguerite Horner, Barbara Howie, Lee Meltzer, Sean Williams, and myself. And it's very much about exploring and documenting the neglected environs found on the margins of urban living, which is what Marion Shord was sort of thinking about when she coined the term. Did you want to come in, Fun? That's cool. So this evening we're fortunate to have Iain and Nick talk about these strange areas on the edge of urban living. Both of them have written extensively about that, Iain with London Orbital in particular, and Nick with his book Scarp. And so I think to start the evening, I'm going to ask them both to read a small section from their books, and then we'll take it from there.
Who's going first? You go first. Okay.
I'm going to, as ever, contradict everything we've heard already, because that makes it much more interesting. What's happened here is this is the third time we've done this, and it's not a static thing at all. We started off in a crypt of a church in London, just off a main road. Then we moved down to Deptford, John Marlowe's Deptford, where which is supposed to be the new Hackney, but it's a very slow dissolve. It's been happening over a long period of time, but it had a very edgy urban aspect to it, as well as the sort of thrusting culture that we were in. So it felt very different there. And now we're finally kind of arrived at Cambridge, which I never quite know whether Cambridge is the edgeland of London or whether London is the edgeland of Cambridge, a sort of tolerated blot somewhere over the horizon. But my own feeling about edgelands over this period of these three events, and it's really interesting to see the whole synthesis of the combination of dance and paintings interacting with the buildings and the spaces and how that works in the territory. And Nick, I noticed in Deptford, was kind of hovering in the street like a shadow. It was like a kind of figure out of an expressionist film. And here I see him in the distance in a garden with the sculptural things, and it becomes a really elegant thing. And so this whole edgeland thing is shifting, and my idea of edgelands has become much more specific to the city. I think things are turning inside out, and the real edgeland now is between the virtual and the actual, in terms of the vast globalizations of politics and the destruction of locality, so that you can't fixate edgelands as being any more this rim of the city. There's a romance about that, and Nick, in the first reading we did a really beautifully poetic take on his own personal edgelands in northwest London, in which he became the thing he was describing in a kind of Blakean way. He identified so intimately with this zone just off the roads, and the botany of that place, that it really brought it to life in a very, very vivid way. Now I think that's challengeable as a thesis. I came in recently on a walk down Watling Street from Dover to London with the notion of finishing on Westminster Bridge. And at that very moment, of course, these things happened on Westminster Bridge where some kind of derangement and a van is killing people on that bridge. And you see that the whole sense of the Watling Street as being a road of colonialization, the Romans coming in, the kind of the darker energies of that are all there, and strongly. And the connection to Nick was that at Shooter's Hill there was a visionary writer who worked in comic books and all sorts of things, a mentor to Alan Moore called Steve Moore. He lived right on the top of this hill, and he wanted, when he passed away, finally, to have his ashes scattered on the last Bronze Age burial mound up there, one of 6. It's the only one left. All the rest have been turned into suburban housing. And sure enough, Alan Moore had written a beautiful description in a book called City of Disappearances about his debt to Steve and the life of Steve, a strange life, almost hermetic life in this house at the top of Shooter's Hill. And he projected a kind of version of Steve's last walk. And Steve in his life then felt obliged to undertake the walk that Alan Moore had put him into. And at the end of it he's contemplating this burial mound, this Bronze Age burial mound. And he sees at that moment how he becomes the city. He looks at it and his eyes are becoming the windows of the suburban houses. He's completely integrated with his landscape. And at that point he goes home and conveniently dies. He's dreamt it, and he keeps a dream journal which is there of a ladder being put up against his window and someone coming up and him falling. And sure enough, he died in his writing room. And a few days later, the neighbours alerted the fire brigade, and ladders were put up to this window, and they came in and peered in as if this had all happened already and it was preordained. Even more extraordinary, this happened on a Friday. Over the Saturday and the Sunday, 3-4 neighbours that were talked to saw him still walking this circuit in the same blue shirt he'd been wearing. So I sense, we're coming a whole circle back to what Nick was talking about at the end, but the Edgeland itself has shifted. That's probably too much of an introduction, but it puts you to, I've reached a point of the end of a long period of writing about London, and I think now it can't be done in the same way that I've done. I've moved from starting off when I was a parks gardener and things, writing about self-publishing books of poetry and so on about London, and describing the patterns of energies in Hawksmoor churches, then moving through fiction in the 1980s to the sort of material we're talking about now, the Edgelands material, London Orbital, looking at motorways and so on. And now I feel that the city itself has so committed itself to a present tense of electronic digital devices that it's really, really very difficult to make the contacts that I was making and to write in the same way. So I kind of brought the sequence to an end. And the little bit I'd like to read now is extracted from a walk, an Edgeland, or would have been seen as an Edgeland walk, from Waltham Abbey, where apparently King Harold is buried after the Battle of Hastings, down to Battle Abbey, where also he's apparently buried, according to the Normans. His body was chopped up and scattered. It's a bit like Osiris, and the woman who stitched him all together is the wonderful figure called Edith Swanneck. So we were recapitulating this walk, and this brought us past the Olympic site. I'd written quite a lot about the Olympic site, and almost got myself lynched in Cheltenham by talking about it at the time, when to be off message was to be, a renegade of the worst water. So this is coming back there, but it's also coming back to where I began with my book Lud Heat. It was a dream landscape when I made a slow circuit of the Olympic Park in the aftermath of our war, a posthumous dream. I couldn't convince myself that I was really here. The panoramic sweep that Sunday morning was a single sentence outside time and beyond place. I put it down to fatigue and boredom and frustration and a flash forward to a future that could manage very well without me. The entrance by way of Hackney Wick came through sentimental corridors of squalor I no longer trusted, protest copywriting, spray can obscenities approved by counter-narrative committees charged with dressing a small zone with the right sort of opposition in order to make East Village and Canal Side edgier and more authentic. The borderland bushes and the concrete vaults under flyovers showed the usual signs of occupation. There were flattened shrubs, there were tunnels into the thorn, cans and blue bags rammed into mesh fences, and among the devil's heads and wolf serpent nightmares, the H group had made a loud pitch, "More land required." The Lord Napier pub is an anarchist artwork, shithouse to penthouse. Meanwhile, in East London, lunatics decorate the building. The walls are sticky Rauschenberg composites, overlays, tattered advertisements, household paint, lumps, growth, found objects. The neighbouring buildings offering household product has a punt at a blue-plaque heritage. Zamo has been in the Wick since 1960, a third-generation firm business named after the family's prize-winning greyhound. I stepped back to allow a focused jogger in a talk with your feet vest a free passage. On the wall behind him it says 9/11, 15 years of lies. The Olympic Park is a game reserve, lacking beasts as yet, but awe-inspiring in its privileged emptiness. Miles of unoccupied concrete floor at Here East, enough for regiments of rough sleepers. Helicopters overhead, flight path tourism, and downward-staring surveillance cameras like postmodern design features. The vision, this blighted Eden, this radiant hub, was awe-inspiring in the style of a cross-section diagram of an improving boys' comic from my childhood in the 1950s. A canal with cyclists and joggers, scattered statement buildings too new to be used, polished roads, retail village, casino, breakfast bars, residential towers, muck heaps, public art, perceptual construction, helicopters, drones, shuttling trains, and huge skies. But the sight that had me laughing out loud was this rank of pristine swan pedalers parked on a stretch of the river and staring straight at Westfield. Poor Edith, this was the name of our peddler. It seemed that our absurdist voyage, crashing a Hastings peddler against the chains of the emerging park, had now been neatly subverted in the 4 years between the Stratford and the Rio Olympics, from a provocation to inspiration for the latest promotional gimmick. The entire working model for this regeneration project, the ArcelorMittal helter-skelter, the Swan Peddler ride, was a straight steal from the Flamingo Amusement Park in Hastings. Our liberated swan, consorting with vagrants and river rats with Alan Moore and Stuart Lee, was now available as one of the park's main visitor attractions. I ran. I barged through ribbons of red and blue tape, shrugging off patronising hugs reserved for the charitable athletes who made it to the line. I escaped, and I found myself catching up with earlier identities, with adventures on the northern sewage outflow, the improved cycle-friendly greenway. I was heading towards Victoria Park, which more than ever now felt like a proper park, an oasis, a green lung. I finished exactly where I found myself 42 years ago at the start of my theoretical London project, when I ran the oracle for a self-published book called Blood Heat. No word other than the need for it. I came up against a wartime relic, a six-sided concrete pillbox, a shrine guarding the River Lee close to the point where the old Roman road made its original ford. All those intervening years had brought me was a better class of confusion, obfuscation and error, a misreading of signs and symbols. I stopped. The pillbox was intact and unimproved. It survived between blocks of exposed flats and the London Stadium, this Death Star. On the wall beside the bridge, someone had sprayed a naked plea. Help me. I looked through one of the machine gun slats, and on the pillar, at the concrete core of the bunker, was the outline of a ghostly figure drawn in chalk. it was King Lud as a green man. It was a phallic stake that had been driven through his cheating heart.
Thank you.
Nice. And this is from your new book.
This is from a new book called The Last London, and it's out in September.
Wonderful,
Brilliant.
wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Over to you, Nick.
Hello, everyone. It's very nice to be back in Cambridge. I did my A-levels here at what used to be called the Cambridge College of Arts and Technology, CCAT. This was in the late 70s. I don't know what the college is called now. Thank you very much. Thank you. The city's changed so much. Frankly, I don't know how you've managed to put up with it. I remember a lot of Cambridge as being nice sort of 18th century, 19th century houses, and I'm shocked at all the redevelopment here. I got lost around the station. I used to take a lot of Billy Whiz and wander around Cambridge all night in my punk days, and I knew the topography of Cambridge pretty well, but I don't remember it at all now because there's so many new buildings everywhere. Who are these people moving in and taking over, pushing everything aside? I live in a council estate near Golders Green in North London. We have 3 beautiful tower blocks that were erected in the early 60s. It's a very quiet estate, and we have an extensive green between the tower blocks. And now the land has been sold off and has been turned into houses, and our green has been turned into the back gardens for private houses. I have to ask myself, how does this process happen where all this money gets invested and they kind of bully their way in? Usually they can get round you by saying, well, people need somewhere to live, which kind of like puts the sort of guilt trip or the onus on you to respond to that. I thought it was a real shame. And this is my book, Scarp, which is it's slightly embarrassing, actually. This came out 5 years ago and I haven't had anything else published since. And I love this book dearly. When I wrote this book, which is about a belt of highland that runs between, basically North London and then into the Hertfordshire countryside, 17-mile long belt of highland. When I wrote the book, I definitely kind of fused with the landscape in some kind of way. I became quite delirious, and it was a great time for me, actually. This is a section about Moor Park, which is a posh golf course and suburb just over the Middlesex-Hertfordshire border. I suppose you could call it northwest London, but it's actually technically Hertfordshire. There's a big 18th century house at the top of the golf course, and it's where they planned Operation Market Garden, the Air Force attack, the paratrooper attack, an attempt to gain bridges over the River Rhine in September 1944. Exposure to the mossy pavements, high hedges and broad-fronted quality villas that skirt the east side of the golf course wakens some port-supping retrograde hidden inside me, a latent Tory who wishes that he too belonged in this discreet conservation zone with its statued gardens and gravel drives. Born in 1936 and established in my profession by the early 1960s, I barely noticed the bell-bottomed, hairy Dionysiac of those who were born 5 or so years later than me, and what little of it did register, a somewhat fey computer engineer who opted out of a city firm I worked for in order to study electronic music in Brazil, the ungrateful son of an elder colleague of mine who was caught making LSD in his cottage in Wales, left me wholly contemptuous and proud to be non-comprehending, totally devoted as I was to more socially acceptable modes of intoxication, these provided by the wine merchants and my doctor. I was never young, though I have surpassed myself in growing old, and if I say so myself, it suits me. And here is my fine Dutch-style house with its stained glass window depicting a windmill and a boy smoking a meerschaum. Here are my neighbours, curly-haired and sensible Mr. Bolt on the right, his collection of lovingly polished sports cars parked out front, In some fit of ageing bachelorism, he has named his house Nadgers. Mr. and Mrs. Jitendra Pandya on the left call their house Prayan, a Bengali word meaning stream of life. They are very polite and always smile when they pass me in the street, though their daughter is angrily third world militant, even as she clubs all night in town or flies off regularly on the back of the family wealth. And when I go into the back garden in the evening to smoke by the potting shed, I experience the dark mass of Moor Park rising over the garden fence as a geomantic node point, a nodule of energy pumping its pure stream of English life directly through to me. This owl-haunted, tree-tangled giant rears over me as I sit on my daughter's swing under the apple tree and speaks of history and stability, of an England that will never fade. I hear its voice also in the predictable jokes of my fellow club members, for how could I not join up, steep though the cost is? The rakes down from the Chalfonts in their MG midgets, hawk-eyed senior policemen and silver-haired barristers with whom they share a shoddy mutualism. And in the frosty morning when I guide my power caddy electric golf trolley across the crisp green and the coots slide on the ice pond, I enjoy once more this most civilised of games. I hear the puck of the iron hitting the ball. I luxuriate in my buttock-clenched arch-backed satisfaction, the virile poise maintained surprisingly well in one my age, as away the ball carries before glugging down into an England that persists despite the polyglot entreaties of the more recently signed-up members of the club. After returning to the clubhouse, my business affairs are discussed with colleagues in hushed tones, out of earshot of all this mess, all this displaced personage. Our condemnation of these somewhat exotic gentlemen is expressed quietly from fear of retaliation, and always, on finding another who shares my views on this matter, there is at first the relief of identification, and then, inexplicably, the shame. Back in 1971, I took my brother and his pal, the Tory MP Reginald Maudling, around the course. Maudling was in a lather about Northern Ireland and the imminent visit of Alice Cooper to our shores. "Lock 'em up, I say," he barked, speaking of the internment without trial he was shortly to implement. Not that this affected his game, you understand. Reggie was renowned for his old-fashioned palm grip, for his sitting well down to the shot, and above all for the number and ferocity of his waggles. He was equally master of the artistic hook, his right foot creeping ever a little farther back down his waggles till he was poised for the shot. His best that afternoon was when he cut up the pin with a spoon on the 14th hole. Unfortunately, Reggie was pissed in both the American and British senses of the word, and the combination was explosive. "The problem with The Guardian," he roared, when I mentioned the recent editorial on his policies regarding immigration, "is that it's written by Central Europeans for Central Africans." "Get off the fairway, you bloody fool," he shouted as some lanky-haired relic of the progressive era nosed along the public footpath, fully cognizant of his right to do so. I secretly agreed with Reggie on this one, wishing these Chelsea-booted student types, doubtlessly living on Arts Council handouts and wandering around the stockbroker belt with their cameras and notebooks, while trying to reduce the lives of people like us to a few unpalatable scraps of avant-garde prose poetry, would simply sod off. Yet Reggie wasn't exactly easy to accommodate either. As his oaths sounded over the 13th hole, fading into the trees somewhere in the vicinity of the ornate William and Mary seats on the old North Terrace, I felt myself yearning to escape from this toad-like dipsomniac and apologist for the god-awful civic architecture springing up like boils in our market towns. Later, probably in no real fit state to drive, he left us, roaring off in his jag to visit his alma mater at Merchant Taylor's School just over the railway line. After a round, I like to visit the lake down by where Capability Brown's Temple of the Wind blew down in a gale in 1936. As I smoke and stare at the temple's surviving pillars scattered in the ground of Connell, Ward and Lucas's wondrous ocean liner-like house, reputedly built for an admiral back in 1937, I think of Moor Park's history, its roots dating back to Cardinal Wolsey's palace, which once stood down in the valley just behind the clubhouse of our golfing neighbours at Sandy Lodge. I ponder the great days of Lord Eberry, who built the golf course, of sweet Aggie Hardwood, who broke the club record at the age of 17 back in 1918. I see her outlined in her Oxford bags against the lowering sun on the upper course, her brow furrowed as she follows the ball. I think of Bob Hope, over from the States in the late 1980s to watch the tournaments named in his honour. Though never funny in my estimation, he was however superb with the putt, his ragged octogenarian face split by a comic grin at each successful cut. I think of mustachioed Major General Robert Urquhart, I think that's how you pronounce it, playing around in his maroon beret on the eve of Operation Market Garden, before assembling with his fellow planners at the sand table in an upstairs room at the mansion for a final briefing before the jump. They linger here, these ghosts, providing continuity to the place. Sometimes I fancy I see them carrying their golf bags past the lake, or shagging in the roughs as evening settles in. I hope these apparitions of my over-malted mind will never leave. Can I carry on?
By all means.
There is another presence here at Moor Park that refuses to concede its place. This hidden behind the shops at the lower end of Main Avenue opposite the station. The derelict and overgrown Mirco filling station whispers to me and draws me in through its screen of wire safety fencing, its thicket of buddleia, every time I pass it. And I admit, I visit once in a while to sneak a fag there when my wife becomes particularly roused by concerns for my health. As I stand amid the ornamental cypresses, now run wild, the smoke from my cigarettes wafting across the 1960s style pumps, each mounted on a lozenge of gorgeous blue tiling, I feel my bowels loosen. I take pleasure in my farts as my body releases its grip on my packed life, and I sense my mind being drawn down into the flaking hypogeum of the drained petrol tank deep below. Settling in the stillness of this echoing uni-chapel, I feel the whole suburb passing through me. My thought waves begin to merge with the lives of those who inhabit these inscrutable streets. It is a rich and ancient storybook I read from at such moments, and if I were to transliterate the contents of its curled, yellowing pages, the result would be something akin to the mid-20th century modernist poetry I occasionally indulge in reading, but don't tell my wife about any of this. As the white delivery van belonging to Tolley and Sons, purveyors of the finest quality meats and poultry, pulls up in the accommodation road behind the parade of shops, I emerge, altered and refreshed from my reconnection to the taproot. And I surprise myself with this experience each time I go through it, returning afterwards to my library and settling down into a sort of immersion, a melding with the moist leaf fall, the unnameable fungi of my autumnal mind, only to deny it later when the practical difficulties of my life regain their hold on me.
Thank you, Nick. Wow. Two very different views of London history, I think. How do you feel about that?
I don't think they're so different.
Do you think what I did is still possible? You were saying things have changed. Do you think what I did there was still possible? Because I find it hard to write now in those kinds of ways.
No, I don't think it is. I think you got that spot on, and you've been doing it for a long time. This is not like you'd suddenly gone out and hit on this. This is an evolution of years and years and years of insanity.
That you were, yes, indeed.
But I think it translates very nicely into what you've done in the vitrines out there. You know, on the other side of this is the cargo cult of little objects you picked up, and putting them together, the nuclear reactions between them are beautiful.
I'm a junkyard angel, really.
But I mean,
like
you
all
say
that
there's
stuff.
5 years since.
Yeah,
since the
I've got a
last
lot of
one.
other newer. But you were saying that I think broadly you were saying because of the sort of dense electronic mesh that's
Yes,
now established
yes,
itself
yes.
as our default communication system, that somehow that has altered the city.
I think it has. You know, I think what you're doing here, like the ability to pause and register these different histories and bring them into a kind of a drama and a comedy. People don't do that. They can't do it because they sort of Wikipedia these various characters.
So we, you know, if we were just sort of tentatively to call ourselves psychogeographers for the state of simplicity, you started 40 years ago, I started coming on for 30 years ago, but now there's a lot more of that stuff than there used to be.
But it's now become a kind of, we've said often, it's become a brand, and there are kind of devices where you tap into this in an easy way. The whole point of what you've done is that you're continually out there in the territory, lurking around, crashing out, picking up, registering, dragging stuff home, living in the thick of it.
You're a bit like that
And
yourself.
I'm kind of like that as well. That's
point
what I
fingers,
recognise. I mean, we kind of got together at the point of a book. There's a book called City of Disappearances, which was wonderfully too big, and Nick sent in some tremendous sort of pieces, far too much to actually squeeze into this book. But the one around Heathrow was a really excellent example of how when you try and approach this territory, you are challenged by the state doesn't like you doing this.
No,
You're
guns
arrested.
pointed at
Your
me,
images are destroyed. All that. It's kind of what you're doing is a battle, is a conflict to try and rescue, rip out this material. The paintings have that quality too, not in the same way. No one's going to actually arrest you for doing them, but
I was nearly arrested. We
Were
were
you?
driving around East London, well, way beyond into Essex, where they had an oil refinery at one point. And they came out and said, what are you doing and who are you and all of that. We were told to Scarp.
Yeah, I used to get around that. I had a card from the Welsh Academy in Welsh, which had a picture of me and a whole. So I would sort of hold this up, and they, I'm not sure. It's okay.
Nice one. Yeah.
When I lived in Poland in the 90s, I went down to Nowa Huta, which is a big steel town just outside Krakow, and there were signs all over the place telling you in Polish, that you couldn't even get a camera outside the steel.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a sort of communist state paranoia thing. I didn't realise it was something that applied in Essex as well.
It certainly did. It does.
But you'd think that making a painting would be okay, because that's a sort of different time scale. And obviously, if you're taking a
Well, I
photograph,
was taking photographs. But
you're
obviously
taking photographs to
in order
work on.
to take them back to the studio,
Right.
to maybe do drawings with or cut up and do collage work that eventually feeds into the larger works. Yeah.
Well, I think maybe we have to drop out of all of the electronic media altogether. That's the only
Just
way.
sit there and draw nicely.
Do you feel that sort of gleaning the information through referring to, say, old books and maps or hearsay or going through newspaper archives, do you feel that the information you glean is in substance some way different to the same objective information
I do.
gleaned from
I do.
Wikipedia, etc.?
I do.
I feel like that too, but isn't that just that we're sort of old?
I think we are old.
Oldish.
And I am, and we're sentimental about it. But I think there is something physiological as well in that process. And this town is built around the idea that you actually make the journey to this library. The library itself is a mind map. You get out this book. I was talking in the car on the way up. I asked how I remembered certain things, and I had actually a mind map in my head of every single book I had. I knew, and the journey to find it was a good journey that opened up neural pathways that connected with the way you write. If I could just tap a button and up comes the
not the
information.
same,
It's not
definitely.
the same.
I don't feel it's the same. I don't feel it's the same,
This is
but
what I'm saying. Something new as it would emerge that does this. I mean, the city isn't going to disappear. The Edgelands are not going to disappear. I'm just saying kind of my own methods of doing it have probably been used up. And I'm quite happy to kind of slip aside and do something else.
And what are you going to do?
Hopefully.
I know you've been doing quite a lot of radio.
Not very much lately. Just what I did was nice, because it was recently there was a thing that came up because there's a series where artists choose another artist and they go and visit them and they talk to them and the dialogue supposedly continues.
Yes.
But one of these, who's a figure that would have fitted into what we were describing, David Hadche, who's an architect, did his own program, but then disappeared before he could get him to do his interview of the next person. So there was a big hole in it. So I was parachuted in at 5 minutes' notice because I happened to be around, and the person who should have been doing it lived in round the corner from me. So off we went, and then I led it on the second week to a writer I like very much called Kegi Carew, who lived in Salisbury, or in the country. So the kind of the format of just not being in, there's no intervention from a presenter, there's no kind of voiceover, it just became me, go down there, talk to this woman backwards and forwards. I knew she had wonderful stories, she did, and it made very easy radio. I mean, it was like simplest thing I've ever done, and actually
I think
the
there should be
response
more
was
of
the
that.
biggest I've ever had to anything.
There's this whole new movement about slow cooking and slow entertainment, slow television programs, slow radio. I mean, I loved listening to those two programs. I was full of flu at the time. So for me, it was just perfect radio.
Well, it started with this image that this book is really haunted by, which is in the particular park we're describing. And this park was created in the 1950s to look like a boat. It was the rubble of an area that had been blown up, gasworks that had been destroyed by V2 bombers, and the rubble sat there till the 50s. And this naval architect created a park that has the atmosphere of a boat with high walls. So at the back, people sit on these benches, these cloistered benches, in an amazing way. They find it as a refuge. And there's one guy who sat there every single day. As soon as the park opened, he stayed there till the park closed. Never moved an inch, and this became a kind of obsession for me. So the idea that he could absorb London in some way just by sitting in one spot and not moving with his bags around him, and there was me charging out past him, doing the stuff that Nick and I both do, walking, meet John Rogers in our footsteps, talking, come back at the end of the day, he's still there, in the same spot. And even then I did a night walk around the whole. We talked, I think, about London Overground, where I'd gone around the railway system by day. I then did this walk in reverse by night and saw this guy sitting on a bench. He'd moved 100 yards down the road onto a bench in Kingsland Road. It was uncanny, you know, and we walked all through the night, arrived back the following morning, he's back in the park. So there's something about, you know, that, and then the fact that the other people who use these spaces do not see him. He doesn't register. You know, because you're going through, already people are in conversation with their offices, their mothers, or whatever, as they move. They're not actually looking around them.
No, they're not.
And so the two forms they're in different worlds. And I think that fragmentation is becoming more and more and more severe.
Definitely. I don't know whether it must happen in Cambridge. You know, if you're driving a car and you've got a bunch of young people, generally, and they're just going, you have to kind of pull up quick.
People sit down at tables together in this kind of intimacy of a meal or drinks, and they're actually all on their thing. Even if I was talking to you, I'd be.
Should we throw it open? I'm going to throw it open to the audience now for questions. Yes, Philip.
Iain, what are you doing now? Well, the obvious answer is more great novels, please.
That's what I want to do, yeah.
Yes.
Strangely enough, because from about mid-1990s or so, I wasn't really allowed to do novels anymore. You know, novels weren't selling. They were very difficult things to pitch, complicated literary novels. So I cheated and did more or less the same thing, but pretended they were non-fiction. And as time's gone on, they've become more and more in the mode of novels, but they are dealing with ostensibly the documented world. And this one I finished with has all of the elements of a sort of hybrid form. And having done that project, finished with it, the things that I would like to do beyond it are back in the idea of a completely fictionalized, manipulated world.
And would you contemplate going beyond the England that you know and love,
Well,
or the Wales?
I am the one I'm theoretically planning to do. It happens in Peru.
We have a winner there.
One of the aspects here is that my great grandfather, at around about my age, or the equivalent of being equally old, which would be slightly younger at that period, this is in the 1890s, had managed to lose all his money and everything, and he'd been digging for gold in Tasmania. And he was. This is a terrible thing that my daughter found out about, really, that the Peruvian Corporation of London were given massive tranche of Peru because the country was bankrupt after the war with Chile, and they decided that they were doing the railways and the mines and all that, but there was all this wonderful jungle material as well with nothing going on there. They said, why don't we get some people, 3 people to go there? We don't expect them to come back, but we'll pay them £100 a month to go there and see if you can grow coffee. And so he launched off on this insane expedition, which he did wonderful botanical drawings of, and maps are very. And the only people who could kind of lead him in were Jesuit priests who turned out to be completely drunk. And they stayed as long as the drink lasted. And then, when he got them to meet this particular group of indigenous people, the Jesuits stole the last bottle of medicinal alcohol and disappeared. So they were abandoned completely in the middle of nowhere, and sat there with their guns, trembling, and sounds around them in the jungle. But anyway, they made contact with a person they called King Chokri, and there were some wonderful photos of him, and persuaded him to make some balsa rafts, and they set off down the river outside the territory which the indigenous people usually went to. And it kind of ran up against rapids, and then the thing that clicked it for me was these were the very rapids that are in Herzog's film Fitzcarraldo. That's where they couldn't go any further.
Even better.
So anyway, I thought, I read this book, and I realised that nothing I'd done was in any way original. Everything I did was stolen from the style. While I was picking about down the A13 and doing the sort of Edgelands stuff, he was in the real place, but writing about it in exactly the same style and fashion. So I thought the thing to do would be to recapitulate this journey and see what happened. I could afford to disappear at this point because I've now finished this sequence. So there we go.
That's very exciting.
So that's
isn't
a theoretical project.
it? Okay.
I'll probably write it in Hendon or somewhere.
Anybody else?
What's your next? I mean, you're doing an
Yes,
opera.
Mike, what's your next?
Well, I've just written the libretto for a small opera. A composer named Colin Riley. A sequence of songs about a pumping station, Stacja Pomp Numer 4, in just outside Gdynia in Poland.
Okay.
And I've used it as a linking theme for a sequence of songs around. I don't really know what it's about actually. One of the songs is about a fish plate that gets thrown into a river. Another one is about a sort of potentially fascist leader emerging in Poland. And another one is about beach shacks at Gdańsk on the Baltic coast. But they've all got this pumping station as a sort of leitmotif, is that what you call it, that runs through?
Not quite Andrew Lloyd Webber.
No, it's rather better. Rather better. And I've been teaching at Brunel University with Professor Will Self, the
Yes.
motor mouth himself.
Yes.
And
Psychogeography you teach.
I teach psychogeography, yeah. I teach psychogeography, which is odd because psychogeography is not a label I've ever particularly applied to myself. But basically what we do is Will gives them the theory and then I take them out for the practice, and we basically just teach them to destabilise their perception of the city so that it becomes less instrumental, less automatic and habituated, and they begin to see those little cracks that run through everything, those little kind of funny things where time isn't quite what you think it is, or space isn't quite what you think it is, or places aren't really quite what they think you think they are. Maybe humans aren't even quite what you think they are habitually. And I'm pretty good at sort of zigging that kind of stuff up in people because of years of experience and because I'm sort of deeply alienated from my society anyway, so I just sort of give them a quick start on that.
Yes.
I have one question in relation to the way you tell your stories. Is digital technology disruptive, or is it just distraction when you say the stories, your stories when you describe? How do you see digital technology in part of a city life? Is it disruptive, or is it just becoming part of your story?
Digital technology?
Yeah.
I have no idea. I have no idea. I mean, I just think that, I think it's accelerated everything. And I mean, certainly from what I see, although I've got to say we always pre-select without even being aware of it, what we look at, you know, the quality of what we look at. But I see people having, especially around Brexit and the election and the recent terrorist outrages, so therefore the sort of bulk of the populace in relation to Muslims, what I see with the internet is people winding each other up endlessly. And I've got this horrible kind of Schopenhauerian dualism around people. I've always known that I can look at a person, and I've always known that there was this Schopenhauerian will inside of them. It's sort of like, you know, I want this and I want that, although I might try and hide it. But what I find with the internet is, I'm going on Facebook particularly, is I'm spooked out. I go out into the street and it's the civil life. People generally shop and park and talk and drink coffee or whatever. And then you go on the internet and you see what they're thinking. And there's this kind of terrible sort of tension between the two. It's like, you know, on the one hand, it's like people are very polite and open doors for you, and on the other hand, you'll get something like, you prefer the third Moody Blues album to the first one. What are you, some kind of fucking retard? You know, you get that sort of stuff, you know, it's kind of ridiculous.
It's shocking too, because people let themselves out on the internet, because nobody sees them, they hide behind.
Yes.
Yes, you're right,
Identity,
they hide.
don't know identity. I think it's shocking.
I don't want to sit here like some old, you know, some old tosser going, you know, the internet's no good. I mean, I do use it, but not that often, I've got to say. I personally don't care for it that much, but you know, I wonder if I'm sort of secure in a position of sitting here and saying, you know, oh, it's all really bad, because, you know, in a way, if you were to look at, say, 1970, when I had a stereo and, you know, my King Crimson and Van der Graaf Generator albums and things, and was taking magic mushrooms, you would have got, I was 17, you would have got a man who's my age now, who would have sort of grown up in the early 20th century, who would probably be saying, like, you know, oh, we had gramophones in our day, we didn't just sort of sling records on, you had to kind of wind them up, and, you know, it was much more kind of joyous to actually work for the sound rather than just switching it, you know, so I don't know, I just don't know.
It is, I think people are going back to thinking, you know, oh, it was before we used to do things like that.
Well, did we used to do things?
Pleasure to put the old records out, you know. But now it's all memory now. But we tend to go back to memorize, oh, the old times were really...
Well, I think we retained memory better because, in a way, you know, the internet is your sort of memory storage place. You don't have to remember anything. You know, I want to know about Chopin's ballads, you know, and you look it up on the internet and go, oh yeah, Opus 23. And then you sort of like think, well, it's all there, I can go and look at it again next time. Whereas I suppose in the old days, perhaps you had to put some of it in the old brain cells, didn't you?
You wrote it down on a piece of paper, and by the very act of doing that, kind of connected with the brains.
Well, it's the kind of death of, say, cinema, you know, classic European cinema or American cinema. The idea was, in the 90s, these things were hard to find. If I wanted to go and see a film, it was an event, and so the journey to see it became part of the event.
Sort of pilgrimage.
So there's a pilgrimage, and then there's this great thing that you've prepared yourself for, and you see it and you absorb it with a great intensity. Now, of course, you know, it's everything. Everything is there. But I mean, I don't want to be completely downbeat about this, but I think what does happen, and you said something very interesting. You said you give yourself to it. I think you do. I think you give up a certain form of identity by becoming part of this massive interwoven net of consciousness, whereby physiologically we're going to change. You know, people's thumbs are bound to get bigger because they go all the time. Brains are going to take different shapes. We will become more and more actually like the machines.
To be evolved.
And I think there's only going to be a present tense, because the past will become something that's just instantly accessible. So it becomes part of the present. The future is
Yes.
predictable.
Marguerite.
There's a book called The Machine Stops, that I don't know if you've read it.
No.
It predicts Facebook where everybody just communicates and they stay in their pods, and then one day the machine stops and they have to move out of their pods, and their children are taken away from them, so they don't actually have a relationship with them. They're very scared to come out of these pods into the real world. A bit like Chucky as well. It's another one where people post nuclear warfare, where people are mutants and they can read each other's minds. So,
The Machine Stops us from the 30s, isn't it?
yeah.
Who is it again?
Is it William? It's Forster. Forster.
Yes, it is, yeah, Ian Forster.
Mm.
Of
So
Cambridge.
very much like what we have now.
Of Stevenage.
Stevenage and
Well, I
Cambridge.
think at this point I'm going to have to wrap it up because we will be asked to leave the building fairly soon. I'd also like to
Just
thank
settling in.
very much our two writers, speakers this evening. And also I'd like to thank Judith, wherever you are, Judith Week, who is curator of the building, to allow us as painters to exhibit here. Wonderful space.
Where do you
Thank
go
you.
next?
It takes a break for a month of August, then it goes to Beverley, which is about 5 miles up the road from Hull. And so the In Conversation piece will probably be tied in with, well, I know it's going to be tied in with Hull and the
City of
Beverley
Culture.
Literary Festival. Yeah, sure.
Great.
Yeah. And then
Goes to
Gloucester.
Philip Larkin.
Yeah, yes.
Who's the other poet from
Done.
Andrew Marvell.
Oh yeah, blimey. Forgot him.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sad we haven't had more time actually. I was just warming to
Save
Come
it,
to Beverley.
Save it for Beverley.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.